how did Joseph dictate this book?
It sounds like it kind of goes into what we call a gish-gab fallacy, or at least starting to go into that a little bit.
He's a real prophet or a real author or a real something that they can't explain.
Wouldn't that be evidence for Joseph Smith not compiling the Book of Mormon?
What skills did Joseph exhibit while he's dictating?
Welcome to another episode of Sword and Spirit. My name is Daniel. I'm here with my co-host Tori. And today we have a special guest that we're very excited for all of you guys to meet today. Some of you guys may be familiar with some of his work on plural marriage in LDS history. But today we're joined by our friend Brian Hales. Brian, how are you doing today?
Great. It's great to be here.
Awesome. Well, before we jump into it, Brian, tell us a little bit about who you are for those that don't know, and maybe some of your work and what your latest project is.
The interest that I've had in church history was piqued back in the early 1990s when a member of my family was excommunicated for joining a polygamous group. And so I started doing research on polygamy, which is kind of controversial. And ultimately, I have published a number of books, both on fundamentalist polygamy and on Joseph Smith and plural marriage. With the help of Don Bradley, we published these volumes. And then people would ask me while we were researching if I was worried that I might hear something or find out something about Joseph that would affect my belief in him as a prophet. And I never was really worried about that because I had theorized that that Joseph Smith could not have published the Book of Mormon or written the Book of Mormon without some help from God. And so I assumed he was a prophet in 1829, and I just never thought he would have lost the mantle. So I wasn't worried about polygamy, even though I didn't necessarily like that topic. But I always believed that started as a prophet, Joseph Smith continued throughout the 1830s and 40s. And when I got done, with my research, about 2015 is when I kind of shifted away from polygamy as a research topic. I went and started to test the theory. Could Joseph Smith have produced the Book of Mormon as just using his natural intellect? And I did an article that was published in BYU Studies. And in that article, I identified 5 different theories that were really popular about how Joseph Smith was able to produce the Book of Mormon using natural skills. That he wasn't inspired by the gift and power of God, which is what he said, and which we believe. But those theories involve the Spalding manuscript, that he had collaborators, that he was mentally ill. Some people thought that would enhance his abilities, which it doesn't do, but or a thing called automatic writing. And then the most popular one today, and in fact, I've got a slide here. Let me see if I can make this work better. It's on my end. It's not yours. Can you see that now? This is a chart that shows the 5 different theories across the top. And if you track it over time, we find that Joseph Smith's intellect was in fact the most popular early on, very early, until people got to know Joseph in the book, because the book's pretty complicated. And then over time, when they found the Spalding manuscript, can you see that? Are you watching the slide? Okay.
Yeah.
Spalding was real popular till they found the manuscript in 1884 and discovered that couldn't be the source of it. And then it's a smattering of ideas. But today, in the last decade or two, everybody just says, oh, yeah, Joseph Smith could do it. Yeah, he was smart enough. He could do it. And that didn't ever make sense to me because I really didn't think he was that smart. And so I decided to research about Joseph Smith's abilities in 1829. And I came to realize that he really, I don't think, had the ability. And I've put together a slide or a handout that's on a slide. Let me see if I can share this one. If somebody wants that handout, then go ahead and have them just download it from that QR code. And what I thought, since you asked me to talk about my research on the Book of Mormon, that maybe we could go over some of the things that are on that handout.
I just have one main question, and that is, what was the catalyst Were you jumping from polygamy to the Book of Mormon?
Well, and maybe I didn't explain that very well, but the reason I was interested in the Book of Mormon after is that while I was researching polygamy, I believed the Book of Mormon was beyond Joseph's ability. I believed he was a prophet, and so I didn't think that I was going to find anything out about him in 1844 because I believed in 1829 when he dictated the Book of Mormon, he was a prophet. So I didn't think he lost the prophetic mantle, and so it was just kind of my reason for jumping into the polygamy topic without really worrying about what I was going to find. I don't like polygamy. I think it's a very hard concept, and I'm glad we're not asked to do it today. But it's the kind of thing that, at least then, when I was researching it, I just didn't worry about Joseph because he was a prophet in 29. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does.
And so let me try to share the screen again because what I've done and what's on that handout is I tried to ask and answer two questions. And one is, what skills would a person need to dictate a book like the Book of Mormon? The second question is, what skills do we know Joseph Smith had in 1829? And those two questions are really important because when people today say that, oh yeah, Joseph could do it, and your most ardent anti-Mormons are just saying, "Oh yeah, we know we could do it. He was smart enough." And yet, the people who knew him, nobody said that. But rather than just say he could do it, why don't we ask the questions? Well, okay, if he could do it, what skills would he have needed? And if he could do it, then what skills does the historical record say he had? These are very legitimate questions for the historian to inquire. And that's where I've tried to go with this. Well, my research into what skills you would need actually is a very difficult question to answer unless you take the Book of Mormon apart piece by piece, because then you have to ask what skills would an author need to create each of those pieces and put them all together in a dictation. And so what we find here is that as we go through some of these characteristics, I'm going to share screen again, hopefully this time. Let's see if it'll work for me now. But if we ask, as we're going through some of these literary characteristics, and you'll see this thing on the back here, this is from the handout that you can download as a PDF. But if we ask, what skills would an author need to put some of these characteristics in a dictated manuscript? That kind of gives you a background for some of these topics. And so the first one that I identified was it's has 269,320 words. That's a lot of words. And if we look at books that have been written in less than 3 months, you'll see 269,000 is a lot more, even almost 3 times as much as the next longest book created in that short of a period of time. If we look at it also, and I'm not going to go through every one of these, just we're going to cherry pick a few, but it's the reading level of 8th grade. And if you go online, you can take a manuscript and submit it to some algorithms online, and it will tell you, they're computerized algorithms, and it will tell you about where this book should be for readers, how difficult it is. And the Book of Mormon consistently comes in at about an 8th grade reading level, maybe a little higher. And my dear friend Don Bradley asked this question. He said, people have readily assumed the Book of Mormon was within Joseph Smith's writing ability, when it's actually questionable how well he was within his reading ability. And we'll come back maybe and talk about Joseph's reading skills or his abilities in 1823, but he clearly didn't have an 8th grade education in 1823, at least not through any kind of a formal didactic program in the one-room schoolhouses of the day. Another one that's interesting is that the Book of Mormon has a very small diversity. It's only about 6,000 words, and that's not impressive. If Joseph was this super genius and he wanted to show off his vocabulary, he didn't do it when he was dictating the Book of Mormon. But what's interesting is that it has a lot of college level vocabulary words. This is a very busy slide. But what we have on the far left hand is a list of difficult vocabulary words. And they have a criteria for determining these, but you can kind of look at them and think, oh yeah, you're probably not going to see a 1st grader or 2nd grader using these words. And what we find, though, is the Book of Mormon uses them, many of them just one single time. And Joseph didn't learn them from the Bible, because you'll see column number 4 over there is these words are not found in the Bible. So you got to ask yourself the question, when and where did Joseph Smith learn these difficult vocabulary words? Because if you use them even once correctly or 10 times, the learning curve for being able to use that word is kind of the same. And some people will say that Joseph was very familiar with the other books, like the Late War, Napoleon's First Book, and some of these. You'll see these words are not common in those books either. So it's just an interesting finding that the Book of Mormon has a bunch of these big words. And I've actually updated this chart for the book that hopefully will be out next year, have almost twice as many words on there. Joseph used some challenging words when he dictated the Book of Mormon, and how and when he learned them is really not that clear. The Book of Mormon has 170 original proper nouns. Now, there are some authors who have 180 plus. I've looked at that list and pared it down. Here it is. And these are proper nouns. Most of them are names of people or places. And some of them are, in fact, just riffing on a sound. Shiblon, Shiblum, Shilom, Shim, Shemnalom. And critics will sometimes dismiss this as saying, oh, he's just riffing. That isn't really explanatory for many of the names here. I mean, this is a challenging thing to do, to come up with this many. Tolkien in Lord of the Rings only came up with about 200. And these books were written with The Hobbit over the space of, as you know, decades, and he was a college professor in England. So again, coming up with 107 original proper nouns in the English language would be a feat. Another one we'll look at is there's over 100 different titles for God. Here they are, and they're just scattered throughout. Some of the authors only use one, and nobody else uses that one. But again, if you're writing a novel of 260,000 words, you're probably going to have a half a dozen or a dozen titles for the primary protagonist, and just kind of toggle between those as you're writing. Well, here we find 100, and they're new ones being introduced right up to the end of the Book of Mormon, which is kind of remarkable. There are 207 named characters. Here they are. You'll see some of these characters are named. The name is used previously, Jacob 1, Jacob 2, Jacob 3, these kinds of things. But even the reality is, in the Book of Mormon, you only have a half a dozen people on stage, maybe a dozen at any one time. So a lot of these people are only mentioned once or twice, but even just once, you've got to create a character profile. If Joseph is dictating this in real time, he's got to have this in his memory or make it up on the spot or something. It's impressive. That there would be so many names when he's just working on a verbal product, this verbal word stream of the Book of Mormon. There are 44 social geographic groups. Here they are in brackets as how many times those names are numbered are mentioned in the Book of Mormon. We have 3 chronological systems. There are over 200 timestamps. One of them might be off by 2 years. There's an argument it's not off. It just depends how you read it. But all of these other hundreds of chronological timestamps are accurate. So keeping track of these 3 chronological systems, and one is from the time Lehi left Jerusalem. There's one at the commencement of the reign of the judges, another one from the birth of Christ. And keeping track of those, it's done flawlessly by Joseph Smith as he's dictating. There are 147 geographical locations. By my count, again, there are different counts out there. You'll notice that this list has the land of, or the waters of, or the valley of, or city of. If you take away those modifiers, there's about 100. So that's still quite a few. And there's hundreds of movements between these cities, and there are 2 mistakes. In Alma 51 and Alma 53, there's armies marching to the wrong places. But other than those 2 mistakes, and these locations are mentioned 670 times, so you really have 668 that are accurate and 2 that are off. I mean, that's a remarkable memory feat in the Book of Mormon. And you're probably familiar with this diagram. It's from, I think it's Taylor Halverson and Tyler that put this together, but the internal geography of these locations is very consistent throughout the Book of Mormon. there are at least 15 geographical locations in the Old World, meaning Jerusalem. Some of these we can verify, like Jerusalem, but what's interesting is if you take the general pathway that's described in the Book of Mormon and put it over a map, you find that there is a bountiful, which are these wadis along the Gulf of Aden or along the ocean there, that correspond very much to the bountiful of the Book of Mormon. But what's interesting is this spot called Nahom, and you're probably very familiar with this, but this place Nahom was mentioned on old maps, and there's no way Joseph had access to these maps. It's Nehem, but in the language there, they don't write the vowels, or they don't write the vowels E and A and O would not have been written. So Nahum was on a map, and this is exactly where you would expect it to be in the Book of Mormon. This is a bullseye hit for Joseph Smith. When people say there's no geographic evidence for the Book of Mormon, they're simply uninformed, or they're willfully misleading, because this is a bullseye hit. In fact, at that location, they found these altars that have NHM on them. And there's several scholars who've done a lot of really great research on this, but it really is a archaeological evidence of the Book of Mormon. There's 77 storylines. I didn't make this up, I just transcribed it, but here they are. If I were to actually do this, some of these I might split into more. Some of them are rather complex. Sorry that's such a busy one, but there are at least 77. There's 5 flashback periods. You remember the first time you're reading the Book of Mormon, and you've got the main storyline with Mosiah and Alma, but then you got Zeniff going up, and then you've got Alma breaking away from Noah, and then you've got Ammon and King Ammoni, Aaron and Maloki, and then you've got Helaman's 2,000 warriors. But anytime that you're writing, let alone dictating parallel storylines, it's a really easy time or place where you can get messed up on the timeline or locations. These are portrayed flawlessly, again, in the Book of Mormon. A very difficult feat to do, I think, in real time. There's 63 sermons. Here they are. Sorry, another busy slide. Please memorize that. There will be a quiz, and I'm just kidding. But again, these sermons are remarkable in that they average around 1,200 words. They comprise between 80 and 100,000, depending upon if you want to incorporate the Isaiah chapters that are almost verbatim copied. But they also cover over 80 different topics. They're highly nuanced. Some people use the word multivalent, meaning you can read these sections today and read them again in a week or a month and get something new out of it. It's a difficult way to write, to have people be able to extract new insights on rereading. And again, there's about 80 to 100,000 words of religious discourse in the Book of Mormon. I did want to mention chiasmus and alternates. There are lots of things written. People know a lot more about it than I do, but hundreds of these chiasms where you unfold topics one way and then you readdress them in the opposite direction. An alternate is the same thing, except you introduce it in one direction and then you reintroduce it in the same direction, and maybe even do that 2 or 3 times. And there's hundreds of these as well. The biblical intertextuality is interesting because we have some new data. Royal Skousen has identified 254 phrases between 16 and 236 words that are verbatim from the King James Bible. So, and the way the critics will explain this is they'll just say that, well, Joseph Smith had memorized the Bible, but we have eyewitnesses saying he wasn't very familiar with the Bible. So we have a disconnect there, and we may come back and talk about that. But to be able to integrate these phrases into the Book of Mormon dictation without having an open Bible, and we again have eyewitnesses saying there were no books used. People today say, well, we know he used it. Well, you don't know he did it. They just assume he did because of things. There's no historical evidence. He had a Bible. He bought one later, and there may have been one in the house, the Whitmer home, particularly in Fayette, but the idea that he's using it is pure speculation. And even if he did use it to be able to open the Bible, find the phrase you want to copy, and then put it in there, and to do all this over and over and over hundreds of times, not have somebody remember and talk about it, it makes it really less likely. And yet the people say he wasn't that familiar with the Bible. So again, these multiple integrations from the King James Version of the Bible are a manifestation of a very high level of familiarity with that text. I jumped down to editorial promises. This is something I gathered from Scripture Central, and they let me borrow this graphic here. But the early parts of the text are predicted later that something will happen later in the text. There's over 100 of these, and again, it would require a rather remarkable bit of memory to be able to remember to fulfill all of these. And then there are some that are much shorter. You can have it predicted in verse 1 and it's fulfilled in verse 2 or 3. Those aren't on this chart, obviously. The last one I just wanted to mention is that the Book of Mormon has information in it that Joseph Smith would not have learned in a one-room schoolhouse, probably would not have learned it across the back fence, talking to the neighbor farmer. And these involve three topics specifically: the Israelite law and the trials that are portrayed throughout the Book of Mormon. Olive tree husbandry. Olive trees did not grow in upstate New York. Joseph might have known horticultural terms from working with other plants, but wouldn't have known olive trees. The Bible does mention grapes, figs, and olives, but these are really brief accounts, and the Jacob 5 account is very nuanced and very long. In fact, too long for me. Sometimes it may be a section I just kind of skip past some of that after you read it the first few times. But anyway, it's very true to how olive trees are to be treated, except where the narrative must vary in order to keep the allegory telling the story that it needs to. So it's interesting. And then lastly, the intricacies of warfare. Joseph was not a soldier. In Nauvoo, he was a lieutenant general. But he had not been involved with any kind of battles or warfare or soldiery, nothing like that. And yet the Book of Mormon has some remarkable detailed elements regarding particularly guerrilla warfare and things of this nature. And so these are things that if we want to believe Joseph is creating the book out of his own intellect, he must have studied some kind of warfare book and learned a great deal about it. So this is the list of the characteristics. And this, once you get this list of characteristics, then we try to work backwards to say, okay, now what skills would an author need to create a dictation with all of this stuff in it? And so let me turn this back to you guys and just say any questions or anything, because I don't know how much more you want me to go into it, but you can see that at least with this list, we can go to the next part, which is to asking, well, what skills did Joseph exhibit while he's dictating?
Yeah, and well, that's kind of like one of the questions I wanted to kind of follow up with asking, because one of the things that I know that I've heard in my conversations with critics of the church is that Joseph Smith had as evidence in 1820, whether that was because of the first vision or not. A common criticism or argument that I've heard from critics is, well, Joseph had an overactive imagination in 1820 or prior to 1820. But from my understanding, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, that the only source we really have of that is his mother talking about how he would recite the stories of the Americas as if he were there himself. Do you, from your work with Joseph Smith, with Joseph's intellect, do you know if there's any evidence to support like his upbringing gaining any form of oratory or specifically oratory skills or literary skills? Do you have anything like to say specifically on that through your research?
Great question. And what we find is there's about a half a dozen observations that the skeptics repeat over and over. And one of them is that Lucy Mack Smith, Joseph's mother, wrote in her history that occasionally Joseph would entertain the family by describing the ancient inhabitants of the Americas. And she doesn't say he's telling stories. he gets converted into a storyteller or something. Her description isn't that. It's just he's describing the people that were here. And what that is it gets inflated into being a declaration that Joseph Smith had received a PhD in literature and oratory. I mean, people will inflate that one account. And there's only one other person who remembered it, and that was William, Joseph's younger brother. And William said Joseph did not have the ability to make up the Book of Mormon. He was very emphatic about that. And so this inflating these early accounts and it goes on for other things. For example, if you notice here, people are describing him as telling stories to the family, but also there's one person, his name is Orsimus Turner, and he remembered Joseph Smith helping out in the juvenile debate club, and also described him as a passable Methodist exhorter, passable. In the same chapter, and what the skeptics almost never tell you is that he also said, Orsimus Turner said Joseph Smith had less than ordinary intellect. But what we find is there's one skeptic wrote that Joseph was an adept debater, and never tells the audience, oh, by the way, the person who reported the debating said he had less than ordinary intellect. So what people do is they make Joseph this excellent debater or an exhorter, a preacher, if you will, based on this one account. And it's all just inflation because the account describes a skill that's down here. It's low. It's in the novice, advanced beginner stage. But what people will do is they take these descriptions, and also that he would go out and learn more from the Bible than they could get going to church meeting, these kind of things. And they just jump this learning curve and assume expertise in these skills. And so when people say, oh yeah, Joseph, was telling these stories to family or debating or exhorting or reading the Bible, we need to hold their feet to the fire saying, okay, that's not expertise in the skills that you would need to dictate a book. It could be a beginning level of skill, but it doesn't reflect a high level of skill. Does that make sense? Does that address the question, Daniel?
Yeah, I think that addresses it very well. And there's just a follow-up question I have, and maybe I think it sounds like you've kind of already addressed that, but maybe just briefly touch on it would be, I believe one theory that I believe it's Dan Vogel that talks about it. I could be wrong, but I think it's Dan Vogel that talks about it, and he says that Joseph could have used this throughout basically in his 14th or 15th year when he received the vision, or when he claims to receive the vision. He still had a number of years to basically come up with the story, with the Book of Mormon. Do you have any insights on that specifically, where Joseph could have had years of practice, or I mean, to my knowledge, it seems like the historical record doesn't really support that based on these other historical records of other people that knew him talking about his intellect. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, it again, it's filling up a vacuum or near vacuum with supposition, and that's what Dan's doing. And Dan's a friend of mine, actually, and he and I, of course, disagree on this. But what the common theory, Dan's not the only one, is that they believe Joseph was a savant, a prodigy, genius level intellect, and that he got the idea early in maybe 1820, 21, 22, 23. And so he's working behind the scenes till 1829 when he dictates.
Mm-hmm.
And we've got these little evidences of his being able to tell a story or debate or exhort. And then they just suppose that his skill set went through that learning curve. And in fact, let's back up for a minute, because let's talk about what that learning curve must have been if this were a true theory, if this were a valid theory. Because between 1823 and 1829, Joseph is gaining some remarkable skills. But what are they? We haven't really talked about that. And in fact, I asked a AI to tell me what skills would an author need to create a book like the Book of Mormon. And I listed about maybe 15 of those characteristics we just talked about as part of the question, and I plopped it into a bunch of these. See if I can. I'm going to show you the slides on this. This was a lot of fun, actually, even though it's not as maybe as intellectual or scholarly, but I ask all of these AI bots, if you will, to answer this question. They came up with a different skills. The list of skills is here on the left, and you can see across the top are the 11 chatbots, and some of them are based on the other. Like LDS bot is primarily ChatGPT with some alterations, but you can see they're listing a lot of remarkable skills. So if we're going to assume Joseph Smith is developing the Book of Mormon, we also must assume he's developing all of these or some of these skills, because you can't create the ability to dictate a book unless you have these skills. I hope we can agree on that. And what's interesting, though, is that, and this is a plug for a fair conference presentation I gave in 2024, and then there's an article on this in Interpreter. But I came up with my own list before I had consulted AI, in fact, long before. And these are the 10 skills I really think Joseph must have needed or exhibited. He manifested these while he's dictated. He had to be motivated. He had to have some pretty good command of the English language. He had to be creative. He had to do some research. We talked about that. He had to be able to compose a story. He had to be able to compose a religious discourse, a sermon-like thing. He had to have incredible memory. I mean, think about it. 207 characters are mentioned 3,780 times with maybe 2 mistakes. Okay, that's the Benjamin Mosiah flips that you've heard about. And on memory, we mentioned that the 147 locations are mentioned 670 times with 2 mistakes, and then the 44 social geographic groups are mentioned 1,374 times with no mistakes. And if you put all those numbers together, there's about 6,000 events where he's naming these people, places, and groups, and there's over 400 of those names, and he's wrong maybe 4 times. Okay, the switch on Mosiah and Benjamin is debatable. That's 99.9% recall. So the memory skill is just, it's superhuman in my view. It's beyond human performance maximums. But anyway, he'd need to have good extemporaneous speaking skills, oratorical formatting skills, like being able to put a chiasm in a real-time dictation. How do you do that? You know, that's not an easy thing. That's a remarkable skill. And then mental redrafting skills. And I didn't go through the slides on this, but the most remarkable thing Joseph ever did, the most remarkable characteristic of the Book of Mormon, in my view, is that not a single full sentence edit has been applied since it was published in 1830. So it skipped the content editing stage. Okay, it came out of Joseph's mouth ready for copy editing. It wasn't ready for typesetting, even though they did send it to the typesetter, because Joseph made over 2,000 changes, but none of them involved even a full sentence. That's pretty amazing to me. And so you'd have to have the ability to do some redrafting in your head. That's what the 10th skill is here. And then we get back to this learning curve, because John R. Anderson, really smart guy, said to acquire any level of cognitive skill to a reasonable degree of proficiency, you got to spend at least 100 hours. But on the other end of the spectrum, and if to get up to 100,000 hours, it takes up to 100,000 to become an expert. So somewhere between 100 gets you into this area here, and then you need thousands more to become expert. This guy, K. Anders Ericsson, I actually just made this slide yesterday for this presentation, but he said you're going to need like 10,000 to be, now this is top of the game. Now you can say how expert was Joseph to be able to dictate the Book of Mormon? Was he 100 hours per skill efficient, or was he 10,000 hours per skill? You decide. But the point is that you just don't decide to dictate a book in 1829 and then in 1823 suddenly in those 6 years be able to develop all the skills and then all the storylines and all of the character profiles and everything that's needed to dictate the Book of Mormon. You're developing skills along the way, which brings us back to this slide that I showed you earlier, that to get up into this expertise area, you've got to really, because I think Joseph did show expertise on these 10 skills, maybe varying levels of the 10 skills. But in my view, he really was functioning on the upper end of this skills mastery learning curve. And so we got to ask ourselves not only when did he make up the Book of Mormon, it's also when did he gain all of the skills needed to dictate it in 29. So again, I think maybe I backed up. What was your question again? I
Yeah,
apologize.
no, you're good. So the question was, in addition to that, the argument of him having this overactive imagination, telling these stories, the question was, did he have the skill? Like, was he doing research as early as 1820 to have the skills to write the Book of Mormon? That was the original questions. But I think you covered that pretty pretty well. And then if I could just play devil's advocate for a second. So I think you provided a good case on. I think you provided a good case on Joseph Smith's, intellect, what he had at the time. But something that a critic may respond with, and I don't know how decent of an argument this is, but they may say, "Well, Brian, I understand that you're providing a case for Joseph Smith's intellect. However, if there's changes like, Mosiah and Benjamin, okay, then that could be debated, but where in the Book of Mormon where it says there it's God and then the Son of God, one might use that as an argument and say, well, if this is coming from Joseph Smith's mind, why would he have to, why would he have to change this? Wouldn't that be evidence for fraud? Or sorry, not fraud. Wouldn't that be evidence for Joseph Smith not compiling the Book of Mormon through the gift and power of God, if God Himself can't get this right, going from God to the Son of God? Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, it's very common criticism, and I appreciate it. Let me look at a few more slides. I think let me double check here. I don't have a slide on that. In my book, I go through that. In fact, I have an article that I hope to be published in a scholarly journal quarterly here in the next little while on this topic of what changes have been made, and maybe we'll go ahead and look at this slide, because what I did a couple of years ago was I took a copy of the 1830 Book of Mormon, a transcript, and then the 1981, and I compared them. I took the transcripts, fed them into Word in the compare function, and then it highlighted all the changes, and I counted them. And of the 4,066 that I found, 3,994 of them are 1 to 3 words, 72 are 4 to 13 words. But of those, 48 are just striking out "it came to pass," and then 24 have been deleted, added, or substituted. So there's not anything that involves a full sentence, which, as I said, I think the most remarkable thing of the whole dictation, that Joseph Smith was able to skip the stage here. And this slide shows the creative writing steps and how what Joseph did is produce a book that is actually up here. It's coming out of his mouth at copy editing stage. Now, what I hear you say, Daniel, is that if this is from the gift and power of God, then it should have been typeset ready, not copy edit ready. And maybe people can believe that, so that there shouldn't even have been, and there really are only about 3 or 4 changes that could be doctrinal, because where Joseph Smith inserted the "son of" in place of a comma, was to eliminate from the dictation the idea that Christ was God's grandson. In one place. Now, in the other place, what Joseph did was to remove some of the Catholic kind of verbiage, because Jesus Christ is God and He is the Son of God. And so He's providing some clarity there. But I would argue that these few changes, and there's only like 3 or 4, are simply to provide clarity. They're not doctrinal changes, because there's many other places in the Book of Mormon where Joseph didn't change it and it had the same message. But if you're talking to a skeptic who demands that what Joseph is dictating is 100% typeset ready, and he or she is willing to ignore the fact that the Book of Mormon came out of Joseph's mouth, I argue copy edit ready. Okay, if he demands typeset ready, I don't know that we can help him, but even if he demands that, he still can't explain how Joseph skipped all of these steps here as he's speaking. And to me, that's the reason that that's important. I pulled this slide out because a lot of first-time authors think that you work really hard with inspiration. You write that first draft, and it's so hard. You get that first draft, you do a little bit of editing, and then you publish it. But the way it really works is that you get inspired, you get the first draft, and then you edit and you edit and you edit and you edit, and finally you want to strangle your editor, and then you wish you hadn't even started. So the point is that Joseph was able to skip this editing phase, most of it, except for what I argue is just the final copy edits. And if you look at the thousands, there were 4,066 changes by my count. I would say every one of those is a copy edit. There's no content editing, redrafting, revising. And to have a first draft that is at that stage is remarkable. It demands, I think, some explanation from the secularist who believes Joseph's intellect was capable of doing it. I mean, I don't think it's persuasive to say, oh, yeah, he was just smart enough. Well, no, I don't think anyone's that smart. And then in a minute, if you want, we can look at what the historical record says about Joseph Smith's own skills when he, from people who knew him, from eyewitness accounts. I don't know, is that where you'd like to go?
Yeah,
I'm
we
happy
can.
to do that.
Yeah, that would be great to dive into that. And just a point, like, so one of my buddies here actually at POUI who's not a believer, who subscribes more to what I call the vocal versions or the vocal fans. He loves vocals work, which is fine. But one of the things that I think that he talks a little bit about, it seems to be based on this worldview, that one of the big reasons why I don't say critics, but just people that are more skeptical have this more atheistic worldview or even agnostic worldview, is it seems to actually not come from a place of, oh, it's not that Joseph Smith didn't have the skills, but it's like, I can't accept that he had the skills, okay, or I can't accept the supernatural explanation because I just can't prove, rationally, scientifically that there's a God. So I think oftentimes it may even come from this idea that, oh, well, I can't prove it, there's a God, so I have to find the best naturalistic explanation for this. And to their credit, I mean, like, with Joseph Smith's character, with his writing, um, I, I can understand where they're coming from with the whole idea of Papias fraud. That I think that's probably the best naturalistic explanation, or that Joseph Smith was somehow a genius. I don't think the historical record shows that, but from a naturalistic standpoint, it's kind of the in my view, the only other alternative other than Joseph Smith did what he said he did. It's, if he didn't do it by God, it's by some other way. And the real question is, what is that way? So yeah, I mean, that just kind of comes to mind, like, when as you're talking about that's probably kind of the background of why a lot of critics, yeah, that's probably the background why a lot of critics have this belief or this assumption, is like, I need to prove Joseph Smith wrote this somehow, or through my research, through his intellect, because I just can't accept the version that he said, which was that it was dictated by the gift and power of God.
I like what you're saying very much because we live in a world, it's very naturalistic. It's very secular, very empirical. It's very atheistic, in that if people can't sense something with their five senses, eyes, ears, smell, taste, touch, then it doesn't exist. And people are very comfortable with that. Things of religion talk about something that's above that, supernatural. And of course, we don't use that word in the church because it conjures up, seances or something. But there's paranormal, metaphysical, all of these terms for things that go beyond the five senses. And people will just say, I can't accept that. But, my research on this topic, and my background is, I'm a physician. My undergraduate is in biology. I was trained in scientific method. I get all of this empirical proof and all. But I'm convinced, and I hope when my book comes out, I have people, pushing back on this, secularists and the like, because in my mind, the best evidence on this planet for the existence of something supernatural is found in the level of literary skills Joseph Smith manifested while dictating the Book of Mormon. It is not explainable by the historian, by the scientist, and so what they're left with is a guy who did something for which he didn't gain the skills or perform the preliminary research and all that would be required. There's a disconnect there that, and as you said, maybe people would say, well, I can't accept that, let's go watch TV, that kind of a response. But for the serious student who wants to understand, things that are curious, at least, they're going to say, okay, how did Joseph do this? And they're going to dive into the historical record. They're going to look at creative writing skills, composition skills, rhetorical skills, and they're going to be asking the question that I've been asking for the last 10 years while I've been researching this. And my conclusion, now I'm heavily biased. I'm a believer going in, I'm a believer coming out of this process, is that there is no, rational explanation for the literary skills Joseph Smith manifested while dictating the Book of Mormon. But let's look at the historical record for a minute. I put together an appendix. It's actually Appendix C now. I had to change it around, but I've got almost 200 references from people who knew Joseph or might have known Joseph or heard a correct rumor of Joseph. They're from believers. They're from anti-Mormons. They're from apostates. They're from Joseph's family. They're from everybody. And what we find is interesting because what we find is that with respect to motivation, most eyewitnesses refer to Joseph as negatively, lazy, lounging, idle. No accounts describe him as innovative or enterprising or standing out. No, nobody mentions that. On the topic of English language skills, he may have dictated a few letters, and we know that he dictated 3 revelations, or we assume they are dictated, but no one described him as educated. People, what they do, and this has happened recently, is there's a guy, William Davis, who wrote an article years ago, published in Dialogue, where he says Joseph may have had 7 years of schooling, and it's completely his speculation or deduction. He doesn't quote anybody in that article saying Joseph was educated or that he was a star student or that they know he went there. He's documented Joseph attended classes in the one-room school in the area in 5 locations. And that is all that he has documented. And then he's saying, but then he may have gone here and he may have gone there and he may have gone there. So he comes up with this number of 7 years. And so people in their minds say, oh, well, he had the equivalent of a 7th grader today. These one-room schoolhouses gave you basic reading, writing, and arithmetic. And often this teacher didn't know anything beyond that. They didn't teach composition. Joseph Smith never went in. I'm getting ahead of myself here, but he never, wrote a short story or a short essay and hand it to his teacher for correcting and get it back with suggestions. That never happened. They didn't have paper for that. They didn't even have slates. They probably had a copybook, but it wasn't for that kind of thing. Your teachers wouldn't have known about composition. They wouldn't have been trained in that. That wasn't the expectation. They wouldn't have needed that skill to be hired. Sorry, I'm getting on a soapbox there. Here we go back to Lucy Mack's statement about he would occasionally give us these recitals. And people just, again, this is evidence of him, telling a few basic things, and they are willing to inflate this to be him being the most creative person in the area or beyond. And there's just no evidence for that. We can speculate and go there. William, his brother, said he was incapable of authoring the Book of Mormon. What about memorizing the Bible? No eyewitnesses describe him as a Bible scholar. David Whitmer remembered he was ignorant of the Bible at the time of the dictation. David was there, eyewitness, talked to Joseph, knew Joseph for years after that. What about extemporaneous speaking skills? He did participate in the debate club. He was a passable exhorter. But again, this is not the skill level that you'd need to dictate the Book of Mormon. This leap of logic to get from here to there is something that deserves more consideration, I think, than it's getting. Joseph Smith is not known to have preached a sermon before the church was organized in 1830. He had no reputation as a preacher. There are no one who remembered Joseph mentions him visiting libraries, bookstores to read, borrow, buy their books. No eyewitnesses describe him as having a photographic memory. In 1835, he tried to learn Hebrew in Kirtland, and he was not the star student. I mean, if he had a photographic memory, you just memorize the lexicon and everything comes together pretty easy. But that wasn't Joseph. Orson Pratt bested him there, and that's well documented. Um, there are people who knew him who asked, could he have done it? Michael Morris was his brother-in-law. When asked whether Joseph was sufficiently intelligent and talented to compose and dictate of his own ability the matter written down by the scribes, to this Mr. Morris replied with a decided emphasis, no. And you can read this account, but I mean, nobody who knew him said Joseph could do it, and they all were very adamant he couldn't. John Stafford, a neighbor, said, if Smith was as illiterate as you say, how do you account for the Book of Mormon? He says, I can't. And reading the whole thing is really tells you more about how adamant they are that Joseph didn't have the skills. Emma said Joseph could neither write nor dictate a book like the Book of Mormon. She said he probably couldn't write a coherent letter, and that's probably an overstatement. He probably could have done a letter, but um, Hiram Page said, as to the Book of Mormon, Hiram Page was one of the 8 witnesses. To say that Joseph could do it would be doing myself an injustice. Chauncey Webb said, I taught Joseph Smith the first rules of English grammar in 1834. So what rules did he know and use when he was in, dictating the Book of Mormon? But this is the important thing. Joseph was intelligent. I'm not trying to say he wasn't. He really was a very intelligent individual. But in 1829, he didn't have proficiency in any of the skills that you would need to write a book. You know, you mentioned this idea that Joseph, there's this theory Joseph was a pious fraud. Well, let me tell you, for 3 months in 1829, he was not a fraud. He was a genuine author. Frauds can't create 588-page books. Frauds can't do that. They're actors. They're fakes. For 3 months, he was a genuine author coming up with a really complex and very refined long book called the Book of Mormon. And so when we look at what the people who knew him said about his abilities, we find there really is this huge gap between the skills you would need and the skills we can document for Joseph. And that's where I think for believers, there's the miracle, but for secularists, there's an opportunity to go in and figure out, how did Joseph dictate this book?
I love that. Thanks, Brian. That's great. One of probably the last questions that I have, because I know we're running a little bit low on time, or we're about out of time. But one other question I just wanted to ask you specifically with your work, just studying, not just studying the Book of Mormon, obviously, but your work through just doing all this research. What would you say is the most common criticism that well, not you've personally, but that you've received through your research, or have you received any form of criticism? Because I know we're talking a lot about Joseph's oratory and literary skills, but have you received, or are there any criticisms that you think are either the strongest, or that criticisms that you want the chance to kind of respond to, or have they mostly been covered?
Well, I think for Joseph, the thing that he gets automatically criticized for is polygamy, and understandably so. I mean, if we stood on a street corner in Cincinnati and asked 100 people the question, Joseph Smith introduced polygamy among the Latter-day Saints, why do you think he did it? They'd all say, well, he wanted sex. He wanted to expand his sexual opportunities. It's a given. I mean, he is a libido-driven fraud by almost all accounts. Just hearing that he did that, people assume that he was driven that way, and they don't know any of the details. And I've looked into this a great deal. I disagree vehemently. The idea that this was not something that Joseph came from Joseph's appetites, I would argue. But this libido-driven fraud thing goes back to the Book of Mormon. If we think about it, he was not a fraud for 3 months in 1829. So the first half, or the second half of this fraud thing, he's not a fraud for 3 months. He's a real prophet or a real author or a real something that they can't explain. And so then when you get into the details of this polygamy, this very controversial behavior, what you find is you don't really like plural marriage. We're glad we don't do it today. We don't understand why it was commanded then, but we also learned that Joseph didn't want to do it. We also learned that the people around Joseph, who knew him very well, did not see him as doing this because he wanted to expand his intimate opportunities, that it was a principle or a practice from God. But you only see that when you get into the details, and very few people are willing to, and I don't blame them. So I would just say, look, if polygamy bothers you, remember what I just said, that he was a prophet in 1829. He didn't have the skills to do this, and then just let the other ride. If you want to get into the details, fine. But that one criticism is always in the antagonist's message. They will say, look at all this bad stuff Joseph did over here, and oh, by the way, we know he was a polygamist and that was bad. So they kind of add it as a postscript to many things they say, because for them it's just this slam dunk Joseph was a false prophet observation, and it shouldn't be treated that way. So sorry, that's a long answer there, Daniel, and I know we're out of time, but you asked for one thing, and I still think that people hear about polygamy, make the wrong assumptions, unjustified, and dismiss him as a prophet, which they shouldn't do.
It sounds like it kind of goes into what we call a Gishgow fallacy, or at least starting to go into that a little bit, where you could, polygamy is, I think, a very common one. Another one that people are pretty ignorant of is, like the Book of Abraham, or other strong criticism of, oh, Joseph Smith's, racist statements about, those of African descent. But yeah, I love that. Just to close out, Brian, if there's one thing that you could share with those watching today, whether they be, a believing member, or whether they be someone struggling with their faith, or someone that's a little bit more cynical, if we had one takeaway for you to share, what would that takeaway be through this podcast episode?
Well, you've allowed me to do it, and to use an hour doing it, and that is, look, for the naturalist, the atheist, the person who stepped away from religion, stepped away from the restored gospel, whatever it is. If you will ask the question, how did Joseph do this? Okay, I think you will find that the scientist doesn't have a rational explanation. That doesn't necessarily mean that church is true or that they should come back, but I think that it does um, offer a springboard into further inquiry, and they can do the research and research all of my data. When it's published, it'll be scrutinized, as well as should. That's part of the process. But you can also entertain the promise in the Book of Mormon to read the Book of Mormon, because it promises that a supernatural power, the Spirit, will manifest that the Book of Mormon is true. So they have an opportunity here, as science doesn't have the answer, as natural science doesn't have the answer, to entertain the possibility of something supernatural, which we call spiritual, that will then manifest to them if they're sincere. If they can get there, that's not always easy for the scientist. Then they can know through a supernatural process that the Book of Mormon was created through a supernatural process, independent of the fact that science can't answer it. So that's really the one thing. This can be an opportunity to look again, or to look anew at the fact that the natural world can't explain it, and maybe the supernatural world, as explained by the restored gospel, can.
I love that. I love that. It's an opportunity to learn to come to understand the restored gospel. I love that. Thanks for sharing. I think we're yeah, it looks like we're out of time now, so we'll go ahead and close. So Brian, thank you so much for allowing us to take an hour of your time to interview this. And everyone, this will be dropped probably within our first month. This is still one of our first episodes, so go ahead and tune in next week. We'll be sure to add any information that Brian allows us to have and put it in the description and the show notes below. Well, thank you so much, everyone, for joining us on Sword and Spirit, and we'll see you next week. Bye. Thanks, Brian.